Greetings and welcome back to another episode of the Relationship Schools podcast. I'm your host, Jason Gaddis. Good to be here with you right now. What's up? Man, it's intense out there. You breathing through it all? Yep. Make sure that you're telling the truth to someone in your life. What I mean by that is telling the truth about yourself, deep inside yourself, with someone. When someone asks you, how you doing? And you say fine all the time, that's okay with your, the farther the circle of influence goes out. But your inner circle, tell them what's up. How are you actually doing right now? No. Cut the bullshit. How are you really doing? Right? Okay, that's my little challenge for you today. If you're new, welcome to this podcast. We interview a whole range of people that basically help you get better at relationships and understand yourself better so that you're not so judgy of you or other people. Okay, when you understand human beings, they start to make more sense and their behavior makes more sense. If you're returning, welcome back. Thanks for being here again. Thanks for all the great reviews on iTunes. You guys rock. Appreciate that. And thanks for sharing this with a friend. Okay, sharing this love with a friend. Thanks. In this episode, I've got Sue Carter, who is the wife of polyvagal theorist Stephen Porges. And I've been wanting to have her on for a while. She is a biological behavioral neurobiologist. She's internationally recognized expert in behavioral neuroendocrinology. She was the director of the Kinsey Institute and professor of biology at Indiana University. She was considered the first person to identify the physiological mechanisms responsible for social monogamy. Okay, this episode is for the nerds out there like me that kind of want to get into a subject and get the nuances. So in this episode, we talk about oxytocin and its role in human relationships. And I think it's quite fascinating from a woman who made it her life's work to study oxytocin in the context of relationships. I think it's pretty profound. So I was just honored to have Sue as a guest, to have her say yes, and we get into it here. I think you're going to enjoy this. Okay, stay tuned to the end for your action step. And here we go. Welcome to the show, Sue Carter.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. Sue, I've interviewed Steve a couple times here, and Stephen Porges, and obviously he has had a big influence on the field, and I'm sure you have had a big influence on him and that work in the way that married couples do this, that work together. So just to orient the listener a little bit, will you just give us like a 1-minute intro on kind of what you're up to in the world, or when someone meets you, how do you describe yourself in terms of what's going on in your world?
Sure. Basically, I'm a biologist originally interested in behavior who wandered sort of blindly into the study of this molecule called oxytocin. That began 40 years ago. It's not something I just got interested in. Yeah. In fact, I was possibly one of the first people to study oxytocin from a behavioral perspective because it was thought to be a reproductive hormone. And the notion that it affected behavior was plausible, but hadn't been tested when I started my work. So I've been doing the same thing for 40 years.
Yeah, amazing. And I think you've done some pretty incredible work there. What do you think maybe we could start kind of high level. What's one of the big discoveries over your many years of working with oxytocin? What is sort of the big one or two things that stand out to you?
Well, because I was very interested in attachment, social bonds, the nice thing about oxytocin is, and this was really just good luck, I was already studying an animal that formed pair bonds. It's called a prairie vole, so it's a little rodent. And we now know that though those kinds of animals that are highly social, that's what you mentioned the word social monogamy, those animals are especially sensitive to oxytocin.
Mm.
So we were able to show first in published 1990, that there was a relationship between oxytocin and social behavior in general. And then with a lot more work, and a couple of years later, Jesse Williams was a postdoctoral fellow of mine at the time, and Jesse and I took this model that we had developed and turned it into a way to describe the biology of social attachment, which at that point was thought to be learned, not hormonal. So we found that oxytocin and also vasopressin were critical to the formation of pair bonds. So that was the first systematic work that we did, and I think it had a long-term impact on how we think about human behavior. And then since then, I've written a few hundred papers that sort of wander around these issues and try to specify how the molecule works, where it works, what are the parameters, the things that make it functional.
Yeah, it's such an incredible. I mean, do you call it a molecule or a hormone?
Okay, well, a molecule is a general term for anything that's got a structure that's molecular. Hormones, by definition, are something made in one part of the body, transmitted by the bloodstream to another. And oxytocin does that, but it does much more. It doesn't have to go through the bloodstream. It can go directly into the brain. And so some people call it a neuromodulator rather than a hormone. It's a technical.
Okay.
It doesn't matter, because now we know that oxytocin has so many functions that it's hard to limit what we're saying about it.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's so powerful to feel it, right? And whether it's when we're, quote, falling in love, or when we're making love, or we just have a good experience, maybe. And I'd love you to talk about its role, particularly around pair bonding. And before I do that, though, I want to just acknowledge what I think is so fascinating about oxytocin. If I understand it right, I'd love you to correct me. That when a woman's sort of giving birth, there's a surge of oxytocin that takes the amygdala, or sort of shuts off a part of the brain so that something isn't scary or life-threatening. Is that accurate?
Well, okay. You said when a woman's giving birth. The birth process is often rather a lengthy activity.
Sure.
So there's no one switch that, as far as I know, that flips us from fear to safety. But certainly the process of birth itself is a big unknown. We don't even to this day understand what starts it very well. We can't control birth. So it's the process certainly involves oxytocin, but it involves other molecules as well, other hormones. And this process which you mentioned of kind of switching from fear to safety is probably, and I have to say very conditionally because it's hard to show, but a lot of evidence would suggest that oxytocin can in fact do that. It has that capacity to allow us at least to feel more safe under conditions that might not necessarily be always ideal, like birth. Birth is it's dangerous, it's potentially deadly, and for the mother and the baby if it's not managed correctly. And so, you can't think of much in life that's more scary than being born.
Yeah.
and yet we manage it. And it looks like oxytocin's right in the middle of that story in many, many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Thanks. In relationship to pair bonding, tell us about why, like in an adult marriage, you've been married quite a long time. I've been married 13 years. And what role is oxytocin playing in my marriage?
Well, I don't know about your marriage, but I think in general, long-term relationships are quite challenging. Steve and I have
Agreed.
actually been married more than 50 years.
Wow.
So that's a long time.
That's huge. Yeah. Impressive.
And no one hormone can get you through all of that.
That's
Um,
right.
but
Yeah.
it's easier to give you big answers if we stand a few feet back from
Yeah.
specifics, like even relationships in general, and say that oxytocin came along about 100 to 150 million years ago. It was in some way that is still we're trying to understand. It became available to mammals at the time that mammals started to exist, which was over maybe even 200 million years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in the process of acquiring that particular hormone, we developed a lot of capacity to be social in the way that mammals are social. Birds use a different molecule called mesotocin to do some of the same things, like form pair bonds, form long-term
Okay.
relationships. What oxytocin does, and you alluded to this earlier, is that it helps us feel safe. It also reduces reactivity to stress.
Mm-hmm.
So the stress of life can be made better by relationships, but it can also be made worse or more challenging, at least.
Yeah.
And keeping that whole situation going, whether it's in a human or a little mouse like the prairie vole, field mouse, these long-term relationships have to have a biology. They can't depend on just learning, which is what I think I, and most people thought 40 years ago was going on, that relationships were learned. Now, I think we can look at that same question of how does a pair bond form? How does a social attachment form? And say, well, it's got to have a lot of help because there are so many impediments to long-term relationships.
Yeah. And to raising a child and yeah.
Raising children. The best example of a relationship that is usually not broken is the mother-child or parent-child relationship. And especially the mother-child relationship is sort of guaranteed by biology, by the same biology that allows the mother to give birth, also helps her to deal with the baby and to become attached. So if a mother tells you that she does not love her child, that's a very rare thing and it's very serious. But we know that adult relationships in humans almost come and go, okay? They're not baked into our biology at quite such a deep level. They have to be nurtured. Mother-child relationships, father-child relationships need nurturing too. But the relationship between two adults obviously depends on many, many things, and hormones are there to help us. They're there to take some of the edge off of the stress, to make us feel safe, to create a bond, whatever a bond is, and we still don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
But human evolution depended, the development of culture, the development of everything that we sort of prize as accomplishments in modern times required that humans maintain relationships with other people that lasted some period of time. The
Yeah.
longer, the better in most cases.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. And so you're saying oxytocin is one factor of the glue of relationships.
That's well put. Yes, it's one of the glues. And without it, we probably would not have been able to evolve into the complex creatures that we are with cognition and language and so forth. So that's another place where oxytocin comes into the human story, because in order to have complex thoughts, and especially ones that are beyond our moment to moment feelings, we have to have a big brain. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that big brain requires a couple of things. First, we have to give birth because we are mammals. We're raising the baby inside of the mother and then getting it to the outside. So the original invention, if you will, was oxytocin-like molecules that caused uterine contractions and softened the cervix and lift the baby to the outside. Once
Mm-hmm.
it got there, we had to feed it something. And that something for all mammals is human milk. And we had to be attached enough to the baby, whether it was one we had given birth to or one that was handed to us,
Mm-hmm.
that we would then take care of that sometimes very difficult assignment.
Yeah.
So oxytocin comes in there, and it's part of the milk release, it's part of nurture. It just sits. And when I told you it's 100 to 150 million years old, that's new. All of
Mm-hmm.
the other molecules that you've heard of, serotonin, dopamine, other neurotransmitters, other compounds, the ones our whole drug industry is based on, those are about 550 million years old
Wow.
or older. Some of them are almost a billion years old. And so we somehow, at that
Right.
juncture, we added another compound, and that compound then presumably over evolutionary time, gave us all of these amazing capacities, not by itself, but by acting on top of the other molecules, the other parts of the
Mm-hmm.
nervous system, the
Yep.
nerves, whatever, to allow us, again, to feel safe. It's kind of I like the metaphor of oxytocin as a metaphor for safety,
Mm.
because there are so many things that go into feeling safe,
Yep.
including building culture, not
Yeah.
just emotion.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's pretty cool to hear you saying oxytocin came online really with mammals, and
Yeah.
as a way to help us survive and ultimately thrive. Hey, y'all, if you want to learn how to get your needs met, learn about attachment dynamics, learn how to become a relationship coach, or learn how to work through conflict successfully, come sign up for one of our latest trainings, relationshipschool.com/training. Right? And we rotate these trainings. So I'm not sure what it is right now. Just go to that page. This way you can get me live, ask me a question, and hopefully learn a ton that's going to help you immediately in your relationship life. Would you say that, I'm curious what you'd say about why oxytocin comes and goes. My story, I have sort of a rudimentary story about this in terms of like a partnership. I'm in a relationship with you, we fall in love, lots of oxytocin going online. Maybe we have a kid, but then in 2 years, the challenges and the stress get intense, and the oxytocin, you could say, like, goes away. Obviously, it's still there, but um, and if people then they start to not feel safe consistently over
Yeah.
years, and so what happens there with is it that the stress hormones just overpower
Well,
oxytocin? Is it like what's going on?
that's a really good question, isn't it? Do you think anyone has the answer to that one? Uh, I I suspect that um, this has always been a problem for humans. Helen Fisher's anthropologist, written a lot about love, and she argues that human relationships were sort of supposed to last about 7 years, long enough to get the child that would result from that to a point of some independence. Now, that's based on a kind of primitive culture model. We have a great deal of dependence on others, even though we have the ability to artificially create certain kinds of safety with houses and by having furnaces or air conditioning
Yeah.
and food brought in and so forth. We are still, in many ways, exquisitely dependent on others. And it goes beyond the physical needs to our emotional needs. And that's the question you're really asking me. And I'm trying to think if I could even come up with a single study that really actually addresses that. If you look on something called PubMed for research, it's an open kind of like Google for scientists.
Hmm.
You will find, and you put the word oxytocin in, you'll find almost 30,000 references.
Wow.
But those are not addressing,
My
most of
question.
them are not addressing your
Mhm.
question because the experiments necessary are very difficult to
Yeah.
do and probably impossible. You can do what they call observational studies, but oxytocin itself, to some extent, it's a trait of the person. And it's really regulated in part, maybe quite a bit in part, by our own early life experiences
Hmm.
with attachments. So the molecule's regulated and the receptor are regulated. So a person capable of long-term relationships has often had prior experience and hormonal tuning, if you will, in their early life. If you want to know the best predictor of an adult relationship, it's often going to be how
Hmm.
well that person was nurtured by their own parents,
Totally.
the
Yeah.
mother or the father, and anyone else that was around that could help. Because we are not a culture in which, traditionally at least, humans always had help. There wasn't
Hmm.
just one parent or two
I know.
parents.
So stressful now. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so we're in a period of unique stressors. We're also in a period when we have unique support.
Hmm.
I can go to the grocery store. I don't have to plant the garden, right?
Right.
Might
Yeah.
be better food if I'd planted a garden, but the grocery store as a solution to the human need for food
Sure.
um, frees us to worry about other things.
Yeah.
And also, maybe it takes away some of our dependence on our partners who would have been there to help us in a hunter gatherer situation. They might have been there to help us get food, to capture another, a creature that we would all share
Yeah.
and eat.
That's interesting. It's almost like you're saying, um, because we have so much support now in so many ways, and we can get kind of whatever we want at the blink of an eye. In a way, I hear you saying our kind of relational social capacities in some ways might be less agile because we're not forced to overcome
Yeah.
growing
Um,
food together and living together in community and
but less essential, maybe.
okay.
Um, and therefore left to a lot of other things going on in life, right?
Yeah.
Also, I'm not an anthropologist, obviously, but culture makes a difference in how long relationships last. If you're living alone with a partner someplace or a very small group and there are no other partners, you're likely to stay with the first partner you got. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a complex modern culture where you go to an office every day, meet new people, that's putting quite a challenge on the relationship. And no hormone can necessarily create a physiology that would guarantee that relationship would last. So, of course, you're dependent on other things that you do. I mean, there are obvious things people always are told, and make sense to me, to try to keep the relationship as fresh as possible,
Yeah.
to use whatever physical and psychological tools you have to allow the relationship between you and your partner, whoever that might be, to be renewed, I guess
Mm-hmm.
you could say, and ideally not to have to experience so much stress that it rips the relationship apart. A
Right.
little bit of stress can be very helpful. If
Yeah.
you're going through a shared experience, people often bond to
Totally.
others
Did you get
that,
through that stressful time, right?
yeah. So I don't know. I'll be quite curious after COVID as people look back on this time to know. I think I know the answer. Some relationships are getting better and some are getting worse.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, stress pushes us in kind of either direction, right?
Yeah, could. It probably not too much in the middle because
Yeah.
it is a novel, even in human history, to be isolated with one person is not a typical experience.
Yeah.
We're
Totally.
usually, with others.
Yeah. A couple more questions, Sue. I heard you just backing up a step say that essentially, kind of my summary is if our childhood or our attachment was compromised, um, this is my conclusion I'm making, that later in life, our adult relationships might be more challenging. And then how I weave oxytocin in there is that there's maybe less pleasure in adult relationships. Would that be fair to say that a
Well,
securely attached child might have more, I don't know, oxytocin coming in and out of their system than someone who's, is
um,
that,
that's a big jump from what you said in the beginning, and what I was trying to portray. Um, First, we have to understand, and this has taken me 40 years to sort out, so I'm not saying this lightly, is oxytocin does not always go up just because things are good. In
mm,
fact, the people who we've studied, when we've measured oxytocin, what we have seen in humans is that some of the people with the highest levels have had the most adversity.
mm,
Now, this unfortunately is not the full story. It somewhat, we don't know for sure, but it looks like those same people may have a receptor that's not fully functional. And so their body is trying to compensate.
oh, interesting.
Now, what that does to behavior remains to be seen.
Hmm.
Okay.
Right.
Um, it, People often will ask me if there's some way to increase their oxytocin. Um,
Yeah, I bet they ask
and
you
was that your
that.
next question? And that's sort of tricky, but I can tell you some of the natural things that do seem to increase it that can give you, if you will, a more stable physiology.
Okay.
Remarkably, this is going to sound like a cliche, exercise releases oxytocin, and pretty intense exercise is likely to release even more. So working out is good, okay?
Yeah.
Now that working out could be chasing a baby, but it could be, some sort of systematic exercise. Sexual behavior does release oxytocin. I have a suspicion, and I don't know of any direct comparisons. I think, though, for men, it's one of the best ways, most reliable ways to release oxytocin.
Sex. Yeah.
There's definitely an association between orgasm and oxytocin. And it's a positive one. Right.
Yeah.
So that's a second way. People talk about things like hugs and sort of less exciting forms of activities as ways to release oxytocin, but in fact, the effects are really quite small. But if you are with a person that you feel comfortable with and you are physically interacting in a positive way, that over time may release oxytocin. So it's not going to give you a quick release like sex does or exercise does, but it will give you over time, it may over time help to kind of reset the system in a positive way.
Okay.
It also, this is where this anti-stress effects of oxytocin are so important, because over time is when chronic stress is what really bothers us. Acute stress, the body has many cures for that, many remedies. But chronic stress, which can cause chronic illness, we don't understand very well. But I can tell you one of the miraculous things that oxytocin does, it's a very powerful anti-inflammatory and an antioxidant. And it has the ability to modulate the stress axis. So what you have is a way of improving all aspects of health.
Yeah.
And emotional health is only one part of it. But the literature is like every day I find new papers showing a relationship between inflammation and psychological well-being.
Yeah.
In other words, low inflammation, better psychological health. And that applies to extreme disorders like schizophrenia and depression. So I think that what we're going to see over time is that the real power of love is through the actions on these really primitive systems that are there for the defense of cells and then whole organisms, like inflammation. So COVID, suddenly everybody in the world's interested in inflammation because of the coronavirus. And we know that you can overdo it, but we also know that when you first get exposed to something like a virus, your body is putting out an inflammatory process for a good reason. So the acute effect is one way, but over time, if that fire stays too high, it starts to destroy healthy tissue as well. Completely. And that applies to the brain and emotions. So I think that oxytocin's real power and the way it got us here today was through, in part, through its ability to be a kind of natural fire extinguisher.
Yeah, wow. That's really cool. Very powerful. Okay, I'm just cognizant of time because I know you got food cooking. One more, and this could be a long one, but maybe you can keep it short if it is a short one, which is just, why is it, in my experience, that women are identified as the people with oxytocin and men not? Is it a hormone that's both we equally have it, or is it just because women
Right.
and like what's going on there? Because
The
so many people say
sex,
oxytocin, it's like female.
yeah,
There's
sex
an
difference
association there.
in oxytocin is sometimes not even measurable, which is surprising, but possibly more profound than I even myself realized. I think it's a much longer conversation, but estrogen plays an important role in both producing oxytocin and upregulating its receptor.
Hmm.
However, testosterone also can increase oxytocin. So it's not a simple thing like females have it and males don't. But in the male body, the one big difference, unquestionable difference, are the androgens that are produced by the testes. And these can actually benefit oxytocin under certain conditions. I was surprised. I've just been digging into this literature, and it's pretty interesting.
Hmm.
But testosterone and oxytocin have a kind of a relationship with each other that can be complicated. So
Okay.
men at war can form very strong social bonds. Now, there's another hormone that is more sexually dimorphic, and that's vasopressin. And that is in the brain, at least, an androgen-dependent hormone. And vasopressin is associated with defensive bodily events like maintaining water. And in animals, it's associated with aggression.
Hmm.
It's associated with fear. And so I think that there are some quite big sex differences that still haven't been very well identified. They're starting to come out of the literature. And I think when we understand them, we will have a better handle on things like sex differences in anxiety. The incidence of anxiety and depression in women is 2 to 4 times higher than in men. But men are twice as likely to develop schizophrenia or autistic-like symptoms. So it all kind of balances out in the long run. It's not one sex is better or worse or stronger, but they are different, and almost certainly in an evolutionary sense, that difference came through many generations of interactions with the world and the need for, if you have a partnership of one male, one female, or two females or two males, whatever, somebody needs to take the defensive role, and somebody else often plays the nurture, the person who nurtures. That's even been done in gay couples in a study in Israel. And there were actually hormonal differences, but those differences may not have been there in the first place. These were people who had children. And one of the partners became more nurturant, did the child rearing more than the other. Okay?
Yeah.
So it's just fascinating. I wish we did have more time, but my food is burning right now. I can smell it. So I need to do some nurturing of that meal. But
Sounds good too.
it's been fun to talk to you. And
yeah, thanks so much. And where can people find you? They want
on the Kinsey Institute website is information at Indiana University.
Okay.
And
great.
If
Put that
there's
link in the show
something,
notes.
something. I'm not a therapist. I don't have, anything but the most basic kinds of information to share. But if I can help, of course I will.
Well, thanks so much for your just hard-earned wisdom and love and care.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Okay, take care. All right, action step. Sue's one of those people who doesn't have a big website, and she's not a social media person, clearly. And you can still check out more of her work at the KinseyInstitute.org. She's on there. And loads and loads of articles on her life's work around oxytocin. So check her out there. I'm sure you could find an email there on the website where you could actually contact her if you had a specific question. Who knows? All right. I like to interview some of these elders in this community that have moved this field of neuroscience, social, interpersonal biology forward, like Sue. So I just forever want to have these people, their voices heard, and because they've done such deep work in the trenches, scientists like her. So thanks again, Sue. One action step that I took away, other than hugging someone, which she said has a little bit of an ROI on the oxytocin scale, but the bigger ones are sex and exercise. And I'm guessing masturbation falls in that category if you are self-pleasuring in a way that works for you and that you feel good afterwards instead of ashamed. I would encourage that. Sex and then exercise, like vigorous exercise. That was cool to hear. I've heard that before, but just the way that we can get an oxytocin hit and also just feel good, right? So kind of a simple one. I'm just encouraging you, if you're not an exerciser, to try that. Just commit to one day. See how that goes and report back to someone. Because some of us don't exercise regularly or we don't at all. I would encourage you to do that and see what you notice in your body. It's always hard, right? A hard workout is like, oh, but afterwards it feels so good. It's like yoga for me. It feels so great after yoga. But during, it's sometimes intense. All right, everybody, thanks again. Go to relationshipschool.com/training if you want to get in on a live class with me. All right, we do lots of subjects from conflict to attachment to how to help people effectively and own your needs, etc. All right? Okay, thanks, y'all, and we'll talk soon. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Share one of these videos with a friend. We want to help the planet get their act together around relationships, and you are one of them, so thank you.